Disclaimer. Opinions expressed are solely those of the presenter and not necessarily represent or reflect those of Pixel Dreams or its employees.
Fire!
Welcome everyone to FRIducation. Greetings everyone. At Pixel Dreams, our #1 strategy is culture. And our most frequent reoccurring cultural happening is our weekly FRIducation events, Fridays and Education. Usually occurring on Friday afternoons. Some weeks they're internal meetings for our core team, and other weeks we invite members of the PD community to attend, such as this week. FRIducation is a celebration of culture, and it's all about raising I and C. Those letters stand for intelligence and consciousness. We're here to learn. We're here to grow. We're here to have fun. And we're here for each other. This is a team and extended family. And for more information, check out FRIducation.com. And about today's presenter, Dr. Christopher DiCarlo. Dr. DiCarlo is a philosopher, an educator, and an author. He works with individuals, corporations, and not-for-profit organizations through his consulting business, Critical Thinking Solutions, which is all about thinking critically. He's also the ethics chair for the Canadian Mental Health Association and a lifetime member of Humanist Canada. And he's also the expert advisor for the Centre of Inquiry Canada, and he's our critical thinking advisor here at Pixel Dreams. He's currently teaches at the Life Institute at Ryerson University and is a past visiting research scholar at Harvard University, an experience you might hear a bit about in today's presentation. And Dr. DiCarlo has won several awards, including TV Ontario's Big Ideas Best Lecturer in Ontario Award and Canada's Humanist of the Year. He's also authored several books. One of the latest is entitled So You Think You Can Think, Tools for Having Intelligent Discussions and Getting Along. And also, he's the author of the highly anticipated upcoming book, How to Talk with Conspiracy Theorists, which will be Dr. D's first book published by PD Verse, which is the Pixel Dreams publishing company. And now, without further ado, let's welcome Balance, Dr. Christopher DiCarlo, for the Evolution of Human Consciousness presentation. Take it away.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Daniel. That was very nice. Very nice. Okay, so I'm going to present. Okay, so this involves a lot of the work I was doing as a postdoctoral graduate at Harvard University's Stone Age Laboratory. It's in the Peabody Museum if you've ever been on campus. It's on the 5th floor of the Peabody Museum. That's why I'm wearing my shirt today. I've published a bit about this stuff. I was going to turn it into a book, but a lot of other things got in the way. And so when we were talking about various talks I could give, Daniel and I were talking about the work I had done there and how it relates to human consciousness. And with the theme of I and C, it just seemed like a really good fit. So some of it can get a little technical, and there's a fair amount of material to cover that I want to get done in 45 minutes. So it might seem like a flood of information, but I'll try to make that process as painless as possible. So let's start.
Dr. D.
Yeah.
Before you begin, is there an opportunity where this might be a 3-part series? I think it was mentioned by somebody earlier.
Yeah, it's definitely going to be a 2-parter for sure. If we need more time, then yeah, it can definitely expand into a 3-part series. But for sure, right now, if I can get through all the material today, it'll definitely be at least a 2-parter. So yeah, thanks for asking. So here's Harari's quote: "Consciousness is the biologically useless byproduct of certain brain processes. Jet engines roar loudly, but the noise doesn't propel the airplane forward. Humans don't need carbon dioxide, but each and every breath fills the air with more of the stuff. Similarly, consciousness may be a kind of mental pollution produced by the firing of complex neural networks. It doesn't do anything. It's just there. So I'm going to respectfully disagree with my colleague, Yuval Harari here. And it'll be the purpose of this talk, or the series of talks, to demonstrate to you the reasons why I disagree. So my purpose today is to examine the origin and development of consciousness in light of what we know about the types of constraints that were on humans a long time ago. Now, before I begin, I'm going to need you to look at this and read. And so what this basically means is that a lot of us in various fields speak as though people just commonly know what we're saying, and we get so caught up in our own field of study and the esoteric language that we use that we assume we're making sense to others when they're in fact wondering what the heck it is we're even talking about. So I'm going to try to get through the material using fewer esoteric terms, but there are going to be times in which I have to use terms that are familiar within various fields of study. So we've looked at past, in past talks, I've talked about this environment of evolutionary adaptiveness, or the EEA. It's a time period that stretches about 6 million years ago, that's what MYA, to about 10,000 years ago. It's a very long period of time. I'm most interested, the work I did at Harvard is in this what's called Upper Paleolithic period, about 70,000 years ago to 10,000 years ago. Why? Because that's where the really interesting stuff happens. You know, I look at a lot of different things, how humans moved, what they ate, you know, how they changed physiologically. I look at different climatological and geographical and meteorological records. LGM means the last glacial maximum, when the last ice age retreated or receded, changes in weather patterns, the advent of tool use, artifact records, and changes to survival strategies, you know, developing new tools, you know, hunting skills, that kind of thing. I also look at things like physiological changes, right, including gene mutations, and then look at new faunal groups, or the types of animals that were available for our ancestors to eat. This is also a huge factor that contributed to the emergence of consciousness. It's where the brains got bigger. We'll see that other species might have had larger brains, but it's where ours got bigger. And that is, of course, in the prefrontal cortex. This big bulbous area up here, you see Neanderthal to the right and Homo sapiens to the left. And where they have a bit of a ridge, we have more of the gray matter up front, which apparently gave us an advantage, an evolutionary advantage, and thinking and conceiving about problems that they encountered on a day-to-day basis. So our species, we came into existence around 200,000 years ago. Likely from some other precursors, Heidelbergensis perhaps one of them, but again, we'll look at the charts. In looking at the emergence of language and consciousness, these are two important co-evolved systems that developed simultaneously. They didn't evolve separately. So we're going to look at those carefully. And we're going to look at how humans might have reasoned. That's why, the Stone Age lab loved having a philosopher come in for the first time as an interdisciplinarian. I was a bit of a pioneer in what's called interdisciplinary studies. I wanted to go into other areas and to see how philosophy might add to what archaeologists and anthropologists were finding, how their discoveries helped develop a more robust philosophical understanding of our ancestry. And of course, we can never forget, as the brain is evolving, as humans are evolving, so too are the neural reward factors that are developing alongside of that. So I'm going to talk a bit about a hypothesis I've developed called Memetic Equilibrium. If you want to read more about this, just type in memes and you'll find a wiki account of it. This hypothesis, I believe when consciousness and language co-evolve to a certain level, our memetic responses, that is to say, our capacity to culturally interact with our environment, to these kind of natural occurrences they were experiencing, that's what gave way to greater symbolic representation and evolved conceptual schemas. That just means their way of understanding their environment and how that might have been represented in materials manipulation. So that's basically what my hypothesis is. There was a perfect storm of elements that led up to the development of what we now recognize and call consciousness, which I will define operationally in just a few minutes. So as human consciousness evolved, so did our ancestors' capacity to consider and attempt to adapt to and solve and resolve more complex environmental problems, right? Problem solving, when considered satisfactory, produces a feeling of environmental control, right, of stability. In short, what I call memetic equilibrium. You're comfortable, you're relatively safe, you're relatively secure, you're getting food every day, you know the patterns of certain behaviors of animals, and so you develop this equilibrium that biologists sometimes call homeostasis. But the payoff in problem solving, as we were developing consciousness fairly rapidly, fairly recently, and more sophisticated languages, the payoff isn't just practical in solving problems. Hey, I did the Rubik's Cube. Hey, I figured it out. No, the payoff is you get a zing. You get a kind of a neural reward. And the relationship between a newly emerging conscious awareness of one's environment and sophisticated language to discuss and describe those experiences, led to a greater level of maintaining a certain type of equilibrium to allow us to then fill in or try to fill in conceptual gaps, what are technically called lacuna or holes in understanding what's going on in our ancestral world. So there's going to be three major human factors. I'll spend the most amount of time looking at causality, but also the development of moral systems, and then realizing that we die, understanding our own mortality. These three things, I believe, were hugely important in developing an emerging consciousness. And it was not a useless byproduct, or what's sometimes referred to as an epiphenomenon. It's extremely important. In fact, if we had not developed a functioning consciousness, we're not having this talk today, because we wouldn't have any of the memes, any of the stuff, the cultural artifacts by which essentially to do so. We would still be, digging in the ground with the ass bone of a giraffe, essentially. So to quote Shirley Valentine. So here we have the capacity to explain phenomena in order to kind of maintain what I call survival and reproductive stasis. So SR value. How well are our ideas going to contribute to us surviving and reproducing? In biology, that's all that matters. That's all that matters. Does the species survive and can it reproduce? That's all it comes down to. The two main macro programs of all biological things on this planet come down to that. And so how do ideas have SR, survival reproductive value? Some can have great SR value, some might not. And so this is the interesting point at which consciousness develops here. In other words, fire can be good. Cook, provides warmth and security. It's also bad, right? When there are forest fires. Water has value. It's good. It quenches thirst. It can cleanse. You can use it to cook with. But floods and drowning and things like that. So there's contextual elements to our ancestral understanding of value and what things are good and what things are bad in their environment. So let's look at the late, middle to upper Paleolithic periods. Our ancestors, in many respects, were pretty similar to us. They were shorter on average, but pretty much brain size was the same, dentition, everything else was pretty much the same. We find patterns of our ancestors leaving Africa between 60 and 100,000 years ago. We see a lot of stoneworking technology, tools, their art, carvings, engravings, right? We'll take a look at some of these in the next few slides. And they become much more sophisticated in how to hunt and fish for things. And this is, again, a factor of developing an awareness of their environment. So here in the environment of evolutionary adaptiveness, here, if you look at millions of years ago, 4 million years ago, you can see our ancestors, the Australopithecines, fairly small brain sizes. And then as we come closer to the present, 3 million years ago, 2 million years ago, 1 million years ago, the brains start to get larger and larger and larger. Here, Neanderthal, much larger brain than Homo sapiens, but it's our prefrontal cortex that apparently gave us that kind of edge over the Neanderthals. They went extinct about 30,000 years ago. Some of us have DNA, Neanderthal DNA in us. We now know this. The entire genome of the Neanderthal has been copied, compared with the humans, and we can actually see and compare that. Yes, in fact, our ancestors did mate with Neanderthals. Now, of course, our dentition changes, right? You notice the way it becomes more rounded. Just look at your teeth. When you brush your teeth, we don't just have molars for mastication. We don't just chew our cud like, you know, cows all day or whatnot. We have incisors and we have bicuspids because we were multivariate in what we ate. We were omnivores. We ate all kinds of stuff and a lot of insects, by the way. Our ancestors ate a ton of insects. So we needed to rip and tear and chew. And so that's pretty evident that we evolved from the trees, stood upright, walked around, and started eating a lot of meat, hence the need for the incisors. Our gut sizes have shrunk considerably. Why? Because, you know, we moved from a plant-based diet to an omnivorous diet. So consuming meat doesn't require the length of intestine. If you ever seen the guts of a silverback gorilla, they're huge. They're very, very long because they have to digest that. And plus they fart when they walk. I don't know if you've ever seen footage of them as they walk through the forest. They got a lot of gas and whatnot. So ours shortened a fair bit. And of course, our pharyngeal development, you'll notice the comparison between us and a chimp. And our larynx it drops by the age of 2 to allow greater articulation of speech. And we're the only ape surviving in which a gene kicks in. And at around the age of 2, that's why you start hearing kids talk much, much more at around that age. It's because they have the physiological capacity to do so. So this is the work of Philip Lieberman, University of Chicago, I believe Phil was at this particular time. And then his son, Dan, another great scholar at Harvard, he studied the physiology of humans. And if you've ever seen documentaries and whatnot, this gentleman would undoubtedly be interviewed. He's been on Colbert's show, quite a few others. You look at the physiology of humans, the way the hams attached to the glutes and whatnot, the arch of the sole of the foot and whatnot, to provide spring. We were not a walking species. We were running. We moved around. And this was very characteristic of that. So Dan, Phil's son, we would meet from time to time when I was at Harvard. There were quite a few interesting people there. Obviously, geographic changes. The biggest one is the retreat or the recession of the last ice age about 20,000 years ago. If you're wondering how so many Native Canadians and Americans got here before the Europeans arrived, it's basically through a land bridge due to an ice age that allowed them to walk from what is now essentially Russia through the Bering Strait and populated the entire Americas. Then when the ice age melted, you had a lot more water and a lot less land, and they were continent locked for 10,000 years or so until technology allowed Europeans and others to visit the Americas, which we thought were uninhabited, but we were wrong. Other factors, meteorological, climatological factors, these all had influences on our evolutionary past. Flora and fauna development, plants and animals, essentially. Lots of big, meaty things in America when our Aboriginal cousins first visited the Americas. Cave bear, ground sloths, huge, huge animals that were kind of slow and that you could kill quite easily. You could imagine how they must have feasted on these things. And you know, you hear things about, you know, the natives who were first in America, they had homage for the land. Yeah, no, they didn't. They killed things to extinction, just wiped them out and feasted on these things. Because you got to survive. And there's no McDonald's down on the next mountain. So you have to do certain things in order to survive. And there was a lot of new flora and fauna that they had never seen before. So it was a bit of a kill fest and quite a feast. And that's how our ancestors would have lived, right, in terms of major opportunity and major famine, and because they were nomadic, they were constantly moving around, searching for more sustenance. Gene mutations. Klein has discovered, Richard Klein, that the FOXP2 gene was a fairly recent mutation. And again, this is a gene that in conjunction with the dropping of the larynx allows for the greater facilitation of speech in humans. We would have moved around in small kin-based nomadic groups. And we start to see during the Upper Paleolithic just a huge rise in symbolic thought represented in how our ancestors manipulated various types of materials, bone, stone, flint, various types of others. The wood would have decayed, anything carved in wood would have decayed, unless we can find caches where they were extremely well preserved. But essentially, after this perfect storm of us coming down from the trees, standing upright, being bipedal for a long period of time, right, changing our diet, getting larger brains over millions of years, having the necessary larynx development, our dentition change, all of these things, they come together. And what I've studied is, especially around 30 to 40,000 years ago, the technologies and the art and whatnot that we find really takes off. So that's why I think that was a crucial time in the evolution of consciousness, and certainly with language as well. So we have a cursory understanding, at least, of some of the constraints during which our ancestors faced, right, during this interesting time period. So let's look more closely at the coevolution of language and consciousness. Here's my wife and I in Dublin, Ireland. We're outside the Asling Hotel. And this is where apparently Ludwig Wittgenstein, a superstar academic analytic philosopher, stayed for a while. This guy was an Aspie person without question. And he was a pretty bright boy. And he said something really interesting. The limits of my language mean the limits of my world. And what he meant is that what cannot be thought cannot be said, and what cannot be said limits what one knows about the world. So I think this applies quite appropriately to hominin evolution and the emergence of consciousness. Language is a tool, right? It requires like intelligence, syntax, socialization, vocalization, creativity. And, you know, I've adapted essentially, you know, Dawkins' concept of memes as cultural units of information. These can be anything and everything that comes to mind, right? And they get imitated. So ideas about how to survive, how to live, how to function as a nomadic group traveling around, those are all memes. And this is what I call memetic equilibrium. Cultures develop identities, and this is the way we do things. As Steve Pinker says, you know, the Guarnari in South America have to teach their young how to safely secrete poison from the gland of a toad to tip their arrows to shoot at birds and to be able to eat. That's a meme. You're imitating, you're learning. These are really, really interesting aspects of cultural evolution. And nobody at the time I was at Harvard is doing any work in this area because it hadn't been invented. This is a cross-disciplinary approach of trying to understand, bring philosophy and the evolutionary sciences together to try to come up with a kind of a coherent understanding of how our species evolved. So here we have what I call the cultural explosion, the middle to the upper Paleolithic period. I think everything was in place for this perfect storm. And I believe the artifact records at this point indicate what's called intentionality, symbolic representation, right? Language and consciousness, I believe, were necessary conditions for that type of symbolic representation. You can't paint or create the shape of a horse without some concept of horseness to which that figure or symbol refers. Here's intentionality. You know, here is my cell phone. Could that have been accidentally invented? No, I don't know. Maybe in some bizarre physics, weird kind of, you know, black hole spits it up. But no, just in our world here down on this planet, cell phones don't come into existence. They were intended to. And in order to intend that, you have to be consciously aware of what it is you wish to do. Most of the activities of humans for the majority of our existence would have been blind and algorithmic. Consciousness requires a certain level of intentionality. So a lot, right? We've seen these before, lots of different memes, right? The lion lady, right? About 32,000 years old. So this is that period of the upper Paleolithic that I'm really interested in. Lots of Venuses start to come on the scene, right? 27 to 22,000 years ago. Venus of Willendorf, 25. Lots of them, 26,000 years ago. And then lots of cave paintings, right? Coscar in France, Altamira in Spain, Chauvet, lots and lots of images being put on caves at different places at different times. And, you know, when we see all of this stuff and we look at it and we see that the majority of it occurred at a kind of striking point in history 30,000 years ago, and then just becomes more and more sophisticated after that, it does give us an inclination to say, okay, we don't see a lot, and then all of a sudden there's this kind of explosion. So we know we're conscious now, and I'm going to give you a definition of what that means shortly. We know we were not conscious like we are now when we were Australopithecines. So we know somewhere, somehow along those lines, those 6 million years from then until now, consciousness emerged. And so it became my job to try to figure out how that might have happened. So let's look at basically a functional definition of how we would define consciousness right now. What do we mean by consciousness? It means, right, to be perceptually aware of our environment. But every species is perceptually aware, from an amoeba to a zebra. Humans are self-aware, right? We know that we are part of and distinct from a given ecology. This is sometimes called meta-awareness. We also can recognize the relationship between what we believe and how it affects our actions affect our ecology. So we can modify our cultural artifacts to increase the likelihood of our ability to survive and reproduce. We also have a strong sense of mortality. We're a comparative species. Eventually, we looked at people dying and realized that's going to be me someday. Right? I call this caveman angst, right? The existential Cro-Magnon. And so we see symbolic representation around this time, this cultural explosion time. We start to see, ritualized burials. And fifth, we have a theory of mind. So Robin Dunbar, his work, he's now at Oxford. I forget where he was when we first met. In London in 2001. I think he was at Edinburgh, and now he's at Oxford. So he came up with this concept of theory of mind, where we have a better understanding of what our social standing is, who are the allies and who are the enemies within our little group, right? Where are we on the pecking order, right? Theory of mind also allows us to make inferences about what others might be thinking, right? Methinks he doth protest too much. We can think in the ways of others, right? We can spot deception when people are lying, or maybe they're not being that honest. It also allows us to have a certain level of empathy, right? Various feelings, to be able to know what another person is going through, right? So all of these things contribute to what we might call a theory of mind. So with this greater capacity for consciousness, right? For conscious awareness and language in order to discuss those conscious experiences, we start to see humans have a kind of a greater appreciation, a greater gratitude, even fear and reverence that can be felt personally and then represented symbolically. So with a heightened understanding of our relationships, socially and ecologically, this type of reflective normativity develops. Value. Something is good, something is bad, or right or wrong, or fair or unfair. We start to develop value in terms of our cultural ideas and those that might contribute better to our surviving and reproducing, or worse, right? So this concept of value is really important. Unlike any species before, Homo sapiens developed this sense of worth relative, right, to their view of themselves, their view of others, their environment. For the first time in the history of our species, this would have established a conscious recognition to maintain homeostasis, their biological equilibrium, their health, their capacity to stay alive, to survive. So they would have tried to make sure they're going to continue to survive by adjusting consciously now, of being aware of how their ideas affect things in their environment and reflects back upon them. And this was a crucial turning point in the history of humankind. Prior to developing consciousness, what were humans but just like any other species, right? This is a long kind of term, pre-conscious, systematic, basically reciprocating feedback machines acting in accordance to blind algorithmic processes. In other words, you look at ants and the behavior of ants, you look at bees and the behavior of bees, that's pure DNA. I can't imagine, I don't know, but I can't imagine a scout ant going out looking for food saying, I really wanted to be an accountant. I don't know what I'm doing here. You don't have drone bees buzzing around saying, oh, I fancy myself a butterfly and I want you to use the pronoun they, right? So there probably wasn't that type or isn't that type of consciousness or awareness in lower level insect, but humans, right, would have had very similar types of mechanical built-in DNA acting in specific ways on us prior to our being conscious. So now we have the capacity to look at value. So what we find is that humans can now reflect on their beliefs because they have a kind of a conscious awareness, and certain actions, certain memes can then get this designation of being good or bad, right? So I call this survival reproductive value. And so eventually cultures would have developed identities through a type of memetic transference, right? And so what we have here is a continuation of striving to maintain an individual and a group form of memetic equilibrium. If there were fluctuations from that equilibrium, that would indicate positive and negative value. So a group would always do certain behavioral patterns the same way. We know there's going to be water here. We know there's going to be sustenance there. We're either going to scavenge or hunt or do whatever, right? And if certain things occur, hey, there's a new way that we can do something, that would have to be taken into consideration as to what extent is this going to increase or decrease our capacity for survival and reproduction. They didn't have to think about it overall consciously, but it's there. Every species has that capacity to want to continue to live. So what we're doing here is we're basically understanding these archaic or ancient environments, and essentially we're trying to paint a responsible picture of how they might have been thinking in ways that would have been either conducive or non-conducive to their survival. So what I do is I look at these three important factors, right? These central motivating memetic factors. How would they have understood causality in their world, cause and effect relationships? How did they develop moral systems, principles of behavior, of what to do and what not to do? And then understanding their own mortality. When we look at how burials, ritualized burials occur, how did that affect their levels to understand what was going on in their environments? So it's my hypothesis that when our ancestors developed a capacity to consciously reflect on their environment and then their place in it, and they had these strong kind of cultures with thriving memetic identities, future experiences would require explanation relative to their current conceptual memetic schemas. This is the way we do things. This is how we've done it. Okay, so future experience, whatever they experienced that was novel or unique, what they have to deal with is their kind of group intelligence as to how the world is functioning and how they can survive within that world. So their ancestral desire to solve problems would have required the invention of novel memes, right? The greater their ability for memes to satisfy particular individuals within that social group, right, the greater their value will be, because it'll increase their likelihood to survive and reproduce. Now, here's where it gets interesting. Memes did not always have to be conducive to survival and reproduction to be adopted. They simply had to present in the minds of the group the illusion of benefit. And I'll explain to you what I mean by that. So let's look at these. There are known knowns. There are things we know we know. We also know that there are known unknowns. That is to say, we know there are some things we don't know. But there are also unknown unknowns, the ones we don't know we don't know. What great philosopher said that? Why, Donald Rumsfeld, of all people. He took a lot of flack for this, but I think he sums it up really, really perfectly, and you'll see how it ties in here. Understanding causality. All right, let's look at a thought experiment. So as a philosopher, I come into the Stone Age lab and I say, okay, imagine the following scenario, right? The eruption of a nearby volcano. You live on an island 30,000 years ago, and you're in some proximity, and this thing is going off and whatnot. And you're wondering why? Why is it behaving this way? And we have to understand that what causes the volcano to explode, we now understand as a plate tectonic model. The mantle of the Earth's crust and the capacity of tectonic plates that are shifting and colliding and causes this magma to come up through fissures, and that's how you get these volcanoes. We know that now because we have the science of volcanology, right? We get this. But you have to think how people at that particular point in time might have thought. They weren't privy to our scientific understanding of the natural world. They simply saw things and experienced them, and they tried to fill in those gaps, right? Sometimes they might attribute great power. They might say the mountain god, is angry, and we have to do something. Because as our ancestors became more conscious of themselves and more conscious of what could harm them or better them, a volcano is a pretty dangerous thing, and you don't want it to take you out. So if you attribute agency, which we have seen up into the 21st century of various groups around the world, we continue to attribute agency to things that do not have agency. Why not think that that's a being that is doing something that could harm us in some ways? So the old cliche of chucking the virgin into the volcano to appease the mountain god. Who knows what memes might have been developed, right? Maybe it could be seen as an evil deity. We really don't know, but we do know agency attribution is very common amongst native groups that anthropologists had studied, from hundreds of years ago right to the present. So we have to think phenomenologically. In other words, like they might have during that time period. And if you want to know what that's like, just go camping for a couple of weeks and have very few supplies. And if you get really, really, really bad weather, like I have for day after day after day after day, when good weather comes along, you're really grateful to nature. You're very thankful because living is a lot easier. And so we have to try to get ourselves to think like they might have, right? So to fill these gaps, right, and especially those most acutely associated with their survival, right, they'd have to come up with memes, right, because they're now more aware of what's going on in their environments. So how does that translate in terms of survival and reproductive value? So here's Ed Wilson. I would meet with Ed from time to time at Harvard. He's the ant guy. He's done more work in the study of ants than any other human. He came up with this really interesting concept of epigenetic rules. And so he looked at me and he considered me a bit of a cognitive archaeologist. And so what that means is we have to look at the way, that relationship between hominins, how they reasoned, and what led to greater and lesser survival and reproductive value, right? So as a philosopher, I said, well, what kind of underlying natural logic do all species, not just humans, have to, abide by, or very bad things occur, right? And when memes abide by those particular underlying rules, what he called epigenetic rules, survival and reproduction goes way up. When they violate those rules, survival and reproduction goes way down. And so I came up with this concept of natural logic, the idea of basically trying to figure out what kind of reasoning was being used by our ancestors. So technically they're called secondary epigenetic rules. Ed Wilson said, that's when people would evaluate their perceptions through memory, emotions, and decision-making by being predisposed to use certain means in preference to others. That's really all that term means, is the capacity to be able to use these, these particular ideas, these particular memes. So I believe I have 5 secondary epigenetic rules which I studied. 3 from deductive logic, 1 from inductive reasoning, and a final form, which is really a kind of a mode of reasoning. And what I found is the memes which comply better with those rules, our ancestors stood a greater likelihood of surviving and reproducing. These rules did not need to be consciously acknowledged. Single-cell organisms abide by some of these rules. And if they don't, bad things can happen. And so following them blindly, algorithmically, as long as you abide by these various rules, your chances for surviving and reproducing go way up. So let's quickly look at some of these. The first 3 are from basically Aristotle. The law of identity, P equals P. Something is what it is. A cave bear is a cave bear. It's not a rabbit. So if you think it's a rabbit, The law of identity is going to teach you a very, very nasty lesson. Law of non-contradiction. These are just technical terms. Negation. It is not the case that P and not P can both be true. Nothing can both be and not be at the same time in the same respect, right? A fire cannot both cause heat and burn and not do that at the same time and in the same respect. And the law of excluded middle, P or not P, something either is or is not. It's either raining or it's not. Yeah, but it's kind of misting out. Well, so what? It's either misting out or it's not. It all reduces to those three laws. By the way, those laws are the basis of the criterion of consistency in logic, in critical thinking. Analogical reasoning is the oldest form, we believe, of reasoning. Comparative reasoning, something is like something else. You know, our ancestors see a large animal coming at them. It doesn't look like anything they've seen before, but it's similar. And the last one's 12 of us, so we're going to get away from that thing. And this is the most recent, right? This is the Donald Rumsfeld, there are things we know we don't know. So this is reflective ignorance, right? If A is ignorant of P, then A can be aware or know of their ignorance of P. So this is an awareness of a lack of information. We have a comparative element in all of these types of rules. There's no question about them. They deal with comparisons between things, right? And so, you know, they offer us a considerable survival edge over those less adept or who do not follow them. Yeah, Darwin Awards, it's a organization that gives out awards for people who do silly things that take themselves out of the gene pool. And it's a very dark kind of award, but you can see when you don't abide by those 5 rules, very, very bad things are going to happen to you. So, and then, so how did those secondary epigenetic rules, how did they arrive? Did they just pop into existence? So again, I have a hypothesis that I developed while I was at Harvard, and it basically comes down to this. I believe that our ancestors experienced their environments in a very dichotomous way, right? I believe that they thought in very dichotomous ways, and that they would have observed sharp contrasts, distinctions between hot and cold, hunger, thirst and satiation, night and day, male, female, pain, pleasure, predator, prey, alive, dead, self, others, rhythmic similarities and anomalies. So very, very sharp contrasts, right? And I believe those dichotomies regulated and helped define what our homeostasis and our memetic equilibrium were like. And when we apply these, right, we find that more primitive brains would have more easily detected sharp contrasts than nuances and subtleties. For those of you who have had dogs, cats, whatnot, they either know something is in their food dish or there isn't. I don't know if your dog has gone, huh, yeah, that's nice, but I'd like a little more. If that's, could you add a little bit more to that? They either know there's something or that there isn't. And so when we look at the more archaic brains, it follows that sharp contrast would have been more easily understood. And basically, we cannot rationally, you know, speak in contradictory terms that violate those principles, right? David Hume said nature is always too strong for principle. So it doesn't matter what you think about certain things, nature is going to prove you wrong. If you think you can violate those secondary epigenetic rules, fine. Go to the top of a building and start flapping your arms and see if you can fly over to the next building. You can't. Why? Because nature is too strong, always too strong for principle or beliefs. So those fundamental rules, they tend to be binary, right? Very, very sharp contrasts. So then, as we continue to evolve and develop this reflective ignorance, the most recent one is realizing we don't know something, that there's a gap in trying to understand something. And so this is what led the way towards mythologies, religion, philosophy, science, right? People recognized there were certain gaps, and they needed more to be able to try to understand what was going on. So with language and consciousness, greater problem-solving tools, right? They reduce stress to try to maintain both biological and memetic equilibrium. And with that comes these neural payloads, right? We're getting a zing by solving problems. And the more we believe we're satisfying difficult problems, the greater survival reproductive value there is, and the greater the zing we tend to get. But you got to understand, memes just have to do the job in appearing to reduce stress. You chuck virgins into a volcano and the volcano subsides, and your group believes that that caused the volcano to stop erupting. It reduces stress, your biological equilibrium, your memetic equilibrium. Hey, it's the virgins that the mountain king wants. Those are our most valued possessions. We have to keep doing this, right? Memes just have to do that kind of particular job in providing what appears to be, problem solving, the reduction of stress. So many times memetic equilibrium can outweigh and override biological equilibrium, right? Memes can kill you. If you're a Christian snake handler and you believe God will protect you from the venom of these snakes, you might want to do a Google search on how many of these guys have died handling these snakes. So your memes in believing that you're okay, biology is too strong, as Hume said, right? It's going to teach you a pretty nasty lesson. You might survive 8 of these, ordeals, but it's the 9th one. And the great thing about that is the insulation, the memetic insulation. Well, that was God's basically telling me it's time to come home, So there are all kinds of ways to basically justify that. So memetic equilibrium, it can eclipse biological equilibrium. The more conscious we've gotten, the more we've generated ideas that can actually harm us in terms of our survival and reproductive capacities. In terms of morality, developing a list of do's and don'ts and knowing who's in your group and who's not in your group, again, another powerful element of becoming conscious. That's not how we do things. This is how we do things. And we do them this way because, and then you have an entire, memetic basis that maintains why, and how you are defined as an individual and as a group. And finally, in terms of mortality, once our ancestors realized, that we're not coming back, that members of us are not coming back, that's 0 SR value. When you die, you've reached 0 SR value. And so, it would have been very powerful comparative tool to realize that you and that dead person, you're going to meet that fate at some point, right? It creates this causal relationship of understanding where you stand within that particular group. So this caveman angst required a kind of a memetic buffer. And that's why we see burial rituals where the dead have food, weaponry, art, various types of artifacts buried with them so that they can take that on their journey into another form of being, another place, right? So it's kind of, again, that zing that they're trying to satiate. There's a problem, there's a gap. They don't want that individual to be gone, right? So they've developed means to be able to deal with that and to help them with that. So these are neural-induced gap fillers. They want to keep their memetic security. And so what are the conclusions that we can draw from this, right? Consciousness, again, to disagree with Harari, didn't simply pop into existence ex nihilo or from nowhere, right? It was far lesser developed millions of years ago. It gradually developed, and then I believe it rapidly increased during the upper Paleolithic. This is one of the paradoxes of Homo sapiens. We experience the unity and diversity of a mind shaped by eons of life as hunter-gatherers. We experience its unity, in the common possession of an awareness of self and a sense of awe at the miracle of life, and we experience its diversity in the different cultures expressed in language, customs, and religions that we create and that create us, we should rejoice at so wondrous a product of evolution. Rejoice indeed. What an amazing conscious world we live in. But the subject of consciousness gets curiouser and curiouser. So I'm just going to leave off by saying to be continued.
Yeah, we'll look forward to the next installment. Raising.
Thank you.
Fire!